Hi, I'm Greg Noble from the Institute for Culture and Society. I'm talking with Tony Bennett, also from the Institute, about his recent work in a paper called Mind the Gap Towards a Political History of Habit. Hi Tony.
Hi Greg.
First question, why are you interested in the question of habit?
Because it's a rich mixture of, on the one hand, it's an everyday topic that everyone kind of is familiar with the concept of habit. Everyone performs habit in their everyday lives and routines, and yet it's a topic on which there has been for a long time a kind of very rich philosophical, theoretical literatures derived from a range of disciplines. I mentioned philosophy, but it also comes from sociology, from the neurosciences, from biology, and so on. So it's a topic that's a focus for a rich mix of interdisciplinary inquiry, and has been for a long time.
It has. You do make the point that it's been an issue of debate for quite some period of time.
Yeah.
But you also say that it's become recently subject to lively debate, both in academic circles, and it's also become an issue in social discourse generally. Why do you think it's become an issue?
Probably for two slightly different reasons across the academic and the public policy sorts of issues. I think in terms of the academic issues, we'd have to be looking at the influence exerted by Deleuze's book Difference and Repetition, which kind of gave a new skew that was at the same time an old skew to the form that debates about habit were taking then. If you looked at debates about habit in the 1960s, and it was the literature of the 1960s that I was first acquainted with the issue of habit, debates mainly focused around Henri Lefebvre's work on habit and everyday life. They were structured around a very negative view of habit as a kind of like a repressive form of repetition against which there will be spontaneous uprisings, various people would overthrow the restrictions of habit and so on and so forth. What Deleuze did was to offer a different reading of habit, which stressed the enabling aspects of habit and indeed the necessity of habit. In that for him the concept of a habitless existence is kind of like unthinkable. Habit is a kind of a necessary thing to taking the endless decisions away that we would face otherwise in every moment of our lives. But in offering this retrieval of a more positive reading of habit, Deleuze also acted as a fulcrum point for the rediscovery of earlier philosophical positive evaluations of habit, including most notably, I think, in the work of David Hume, but also in the work of the late 19th century of Henri Bergson, and in between them, the work of Joseph Réveil.
Okay.
The reasons, so that interest in habit has been revived, prompted by Deleuze's work, but that's been a part and parcel of it going back to and revisiting traditions of 19th century thought, including Bergson, but also including Gabriel Tal, that had been neglected up until the 1990s, I suppose, 1980s, 1990s. I forget the date of the publication of Deleuze's Difference and Repetition. I think that in the present, questions of habit have become of interest in public policy reasons, for public policy contexts rather, for a couple of reasons. One is that there are just so many pressing concerns at the moment, pressing matters of concern, if you like, from climate change through to litter habits in cities, through to pedestrian routines, through to the ways in which we will routinely negotiate our relationships with strangers. There are so many issues in which the kind of routine ways of behaving that we take for granted, which is a reasonable shorthand definition of habit, forms of behaviour that have become routine and repetitive. We don't think about them, we do them automatically. In so many areas, how to get people involved in changing their habits in particular directions is something to which public policy and political importance is attached. There's also, just to go back to your question about theoretical reasons for the interest in habit, it's because over the long historical debates that there have been about habit, from late medieval theology in the Western tradition through early modern philosophy, right the way up to Deleuze and beyond, questions of the relationships between the human and the non-human have been at play. On the one hand, it's said, and has been said for a long time, that humans are like animals in that they contract in relationship to their environment, certain routine forms of behaviour, but that humans are unlike animals in the sense that they either have, are endowed with, or can acquire, or can be given the capacity to change habits. Not in the sense of entering into some kind of like endlessly habitless existence, but to acquire new habits. And that comes together with a practical interest and a policy interest and a social interest in questions of habit.
Thank you. I want to come back to that, what you just said in a second, but first I want to ask you about a point that you make, or a question that you ask right at the beginning of the paper, which is an interesting question about how you write a political history of habit. But I want to ask you a different question, which is, why would you write a political history of habit? I mean, I understand a sociological history or a cultural history of habit or an educational history of habit, but why a political history of habit?
Well, I think in part because a good deal of the philosophical literature on habit has tended to abstract it from concrete political concerns or from the social concerns of their period. That's not universally true, but quite a lot of the literature on habit in philosophy deals with this as though one were dealing with kind of like universal properties of the subject or of the Western self, and it becomes a set of issues that are purely internal to the makeup of persons. But the reason that I got interested in the question of habit in the first place was to do with the rich variety of political discourses and concerns that it's connected with at various moments in its history. I mentioned my initial connection with habit was with the work of Henri Lefebvre on the sociology of everyday life, and what struck me about that, or rather what struck me when I was reading feminist scholars like Rita Felsky and Leslie Johnson about that, was the ways in which Lefebvre associated the negative qualities of habit as routine mindless repetition primarily with women. And if one looks through histories of debate about habit, the negative associations of habit as being a mindless, dull form of repetition that cleaves toward the animal rather than the fully human, there have always been at different moments in history particular groups or classes to which these associations have been connected, but not others. In early modern aesthetic thought, it's those who are engaged in routine occupations, mechanical occupations, are regarded as having dull routine lives and are thereby disqualified from citizenship. In post-Darwinian thought in the late 19th century, it was primitives who were regarded as being too close to nature, too close to the animal, their lives too bound up by routine forms of repetition, and this was strongly argued in the colonial contexts as a justification for colonial elimination of indigenous populations. So the history of habit has had massive political implications in a country like Australia. So then the question is in what terms would one write a political history of habit? And for me, I found the work of Foucault a very kind of like suggestive point of entry into these things, because in various ways each of the different forms of power that Foucault speaks about, pastoral power, sovereign power, disciplinary power, governmental power, habit has been tangled up with the histories of those different kinds of power in complex ways over a period of 400 or more years now.
Can I ask you about the idea of habit? Because you draw on Deleuze and Giddens to make the point that certainly they see habit as not being the same as other routinized forms of behaviour like custom and so on. So what's the difference and why is it important?
I think, to be honest, I can't recall exactly what Deleuze has to say about custom. I can recall what Giddens has to say about custom, and for him the distinction between custom and habit is one that he argues that custom is associated with traditional forms of authority in pre-modern societies, whereas he sees habit as being something that is cultivated by modern forms of expertise, so that for Giddens, the difference between custom and habit forms part of a difference between pre-modern societies and modern societies, between societies in which there were no reflexive selves and the development of societies with the capacity for reflexive selfhood. Now, I don't think that Deleuze's approach to habit isn't caught up in a kind of narrative about modernity of that kind. For Deleuze, rather, habits are something that can be that are contracted in all kinds of societies by all kinds of people, and in ways that, as I say, he discusses habit in ways that Bergson discusses habit, that connect human life with organic life and animal life, but at the same time sort of differentiating them. And that doesn't come into view in Giddens' work at all. Those sorts of concerns are not there.
Okay. To me, it's linked to you make the important point that of the need to retrieve habit from its negative conceptualisation to more positive understandings. But I wonder if there's a problem in talking about negative and positive, and active and passive, which is the other kind of opposition. And in popular discourse, we talk about good and bad habits. And I'm wondering whether there's a problem in thinking about habit in terms of any kind of binary like that.
Look, I think that's right, and it's something in the paper that I try to get over, or rather I try to follow the ways in which other thinkers have tried to get over it. It's partly a duality that's there in the literature, in the for a long time now, the philosophical literature on habit has been divided between those theorists and René Descartes and Immanuel Kant, and Immanuel Kant are the most quoted, as having a pretty much entirely negative view of habit as a form of conduct in which the human is affiliated too closely to the animal. It's negative, and it contrasts with the life of disembodied mind, if you like. That negative view of habit has then been counterposed to the more positive assessments of habit as a necessary enabler of social life by taking away the need for incessant decision-making at every instant of our daily lives. That tradition, as I said, that runs from Hume to Deleuze. But even within positive evaluations, there is a sense of habit. There is a sense that the routines of habit can become stultifying, they can become outmoded, they can hold us back. And therefore, the more interesting accounts of habit, I think, are accounts of habit which account for the ways in which particular habits are contracted, but also the ways in which they can be broken with and persons moved on to a new set of habit coordinates, if you like. Moved on or move themselves on. Mm-hmm. And that's always an ambiguity in the literature. The moving of themselves on is sometimes presented as a capacity that all individuals have. In some accounts of habit, that it's a natural endowment. In others, it's a kind of a moving on that's prompted from, not necessarily from outside, but maybe prompted by different kinds of authorities.
Yeah. Well, I want to take that issue a bit further in a second, but I want to maybe get to what I see as the kind of the central kind of claim of the paper, which I think probably needs some explanation for me, which is the central argument is that you talk about the habit system and the way it operates through a gap that is produced when the force of habit as repetition is stalled, opening up a moment in which a capacity for freedom can be exercised by subjecting unthinking repetition to reflection and change. Can you just explain that a bit more?
This is something that I almost tripped across, if you like, in my reading of habit. This notion of a gap when the kind of, if habit is induced within us by the relationships between sensory inputs from our environment that we then kind of interiorize and they become routine forms of repetition, if a person is to be moved from, as I put it earlier on, one form of habit coordinates to another, then something has to interrupt that previous set of stimuli from the environment and the ways in which we react automatically. And incessantly in the literature, I've come across this notion of a gap, which is initially, in most cases, defined as a temporal gap, a blip in time, which opens up the possibility for individuals, as it were, to free themselves from the enchaining effects of habit and to move themselves on, to review, to take a reflexive look at themselves and move themselves on to a new set of habits, to change themselves. This gap, I've encountered it in the psychological literature. It's there in the work of contemporary radical philosophers, and it's this moment between external stimuli and suddenly the individual is prompted to kind of say, oh, I can take another look at that. But it's a gap that has a political history, because what you find is incessantly is that this capacity to, as it were, become self-reflective is something that is attributed to particular classes or groups of persons and denied to others. So again, recalling an earlier part of our discussion, it's something that primitives were held to lack. It's something that women have been denied at various occasions. It's something that children have been denied. It's a capacity that's held to be unevenly distributed across different sections of the population. So this gap is full of political significance. But then when this gap, and it has philosophical interpretations of it, it has sociological interpretations, it has aesthetic interpretations. If it opens up a possibility for individuals to review their conduct and thereby refashion them, it also opens up a space in which philosophers, sociologists, aestheticians and so on can seek to influence how we review our conduct and therefore the ways in which we redirect ourselves. So it's a gap that is full of negative political implications, but it's also a gap that, as it were, can be filled by attempts to positively redirect our behaviour in particular ways.
Okay. I mean, I think that's...
just to add one, I call it a habit system because I think this is something that has received variant formulations in Western thought from, as I said, the late medieval period, late medieval theology through to the present. So far as I can tell, and I'm no expert in this, it is a way of thinking about conduct that is limited to Western philosophical and theoretical traditions. In most of the reading that I've done on this topic and following people who are more expert than I, it's very difficult to find references to a similar debate about habit in other intellectual systems.
Okay. Well, that's interesting. I mean, I think that making habit into a productive, positive thing does pose that question which you've been talking about. And I want to kind of go back to that issue about, who's doing the reflecting and the changing, because there are moments at which it does sound like we're talking about the self-reflexive individual who's in control of what they're doing and creating their own futures. At other points, it sounds like it's a thing. It's a gap to be into which governments step to exploit, and I'm wondering whether is that an empirical question that can only be decided in certain circumstances, or is there something about the nature of the gap which leads one philosophically or politically to kind of conceptualise it as operating in a particular way?
One of my difficulties in answering that question is to what extent is the gap something that we naturally have, or to what extent is the gap a potential that's produced in us as historically specific kinds of persons. So that I think that this gap has really quite complex historical, discursive and political conditions of existence, in my view. It's not simply something that we can assume is that exists independently of these ways of thinking about persons. But these ways of thinking about persons that produce a gap in which notions of self-reflexivity can emerge have been historically very productive. And we are in part shaped by these histories of thinking about the relationship between what I sometimes call the architectures of the person and habit. That is to say, the ways in which, in modern conceptions of philosophy or theology, the person is held to be made up of different elements of volition, of instinct, of reflex, of consciousness, of body, of mechanism, of effect. And habit always plays a role in how these different components of personhood are held to be related toward one another. And likewise, the operation of the gap varies according to what it's said to be able to do in relationship to these different components of personhood. So in some cases, the gap holds back the force of instinct and allows volition to step into the picture. But I don't think that this gap is ever there without there being forms of intellectual authority implicated in the process that seek to intervene in that gap and in one way direct it, chivvy it in a particular direction, to open up the gap and point the subject in various possible ways. And this is by no means something that is restricted, is limited to government. It's not the case that it's simply through government programs about drug abuse, say, or don't drinking that there may be attempts to change conduct in these different ways. It's also very manifest in radical political traditions that this gap is said to offer the potential for redirecting behaviour in radical ways, in ways toward greater fulfilment of a capacity for freedom and so on and so forth. And there are important differences between ways and mechanisms, ways and means that aim to change habits by, if you like, changing the environment in which individuals exist, so that people's habits are changed, or they are induced to change their habits, without their ever becoming conscious that they're doing so. There's a difference between that and those forms of interventions, if you like, into habit behaviour, which seek to induct people into ways of changing themselves as subjects. They're different mechanisms of kind of like engaging with persons and transformations of their relations to their environments through their habits, depending upon whether one enlists the conscious activity of those individuals or not.
I mean, I'm interested in that partly because I think the question of what I would call the relationality of habit is really crucial, the intersubjective nature of habit. That if it's sort of that mostly in terms of individual freedom versus government or political exploitation, there is a whole degree of relationality that sits in the middle. And I'm obviously thinking of the role of education, for example. Professionals whose job it is to, or coaches, sporting coaches, professionals whose job it is to not only to step into the gap, but to produce the moments when those gaps appear and to do something with them.
Yeah.
Can I add to that, though? I mean, if you want to kind of elaborate the idea of relationality, but also kind of changes what we think about in terms of the idea of changing habit, because in those professions, or if we take something like media, it's not just about changing habit, because there are circumstances in which it's the reinforcement and the extension of habit that's really important, not just changing people. And I don't know quite how to articulate the question about the relationship between the intersubjective nature of change and the tension between the change and reinforcement of habits.
Look, I think it's perfectly true that many the ways in which many authorities, sports trainers are, a very good example, are active in the domain of habit, if you like, is that of reinforcing particular kinds of habit, and often they're doing that in a team context. So that what they're seeking to reinforce is not just how an individual behaves, but they're seeking to reinforce the mechanism of habit with regard to how sets of relations between individuals operate. And usually there's something else involved too. principally a ball, as I recall it in most sports. And the reason I stress that, or the reason I pick up on that in response to your question, is that other approaches to habit that are emerging in more recent literatures, and I think, coming out of things like actor network theory, assemblage theory and so on, would want to take a different view than the one that I've been summarising so far, which is by and large one about the history of the concept of habit as a site for the direction of conduct that's been developed over the last, let's say, 300 to 400 years, which tend to focus upon habit as, however complicated a way, a kind of like a mechanism that's entirely interior to the individual. And I think that the more recent and interesting approaches would want to say, well, no, habit exists as part of a network of relations between people and things and environments. Mm-hmm. And so that the business of changing habits or reinforcing habits becomes not just a matter of getting individuals to see and operate within a gap that's produced within themselves. That may still be relevant, but it has to be seen as part and parcel of a process that involves networks of relations between individuals, between one individual, other individuals, social groups and settings, what they're doing together, and what their relations to environments, things and so on are.
Okay. The other interesting direction that the paper pushes us in is the relationship between the humanities and social sciences and cultural theory and the sciences, broadly understood. We've lived in a world where those things have been seen to be quite different systems of knowledge and ways of studying the world and with different objects. And it seems to me that one of the interesting things that comes out of the paper is, and it's also a kind of an argument made by Nick Rhodes, the need for cultural theory or social theory to engage much more directly and passionately even with particular sciences, including the neurosciences. So I wonder if you can elaborate a bit on that relationship that's kind of coming up in the work.
Well, it's certainly the case that the neurosciences now are an interesting location for debates around habit. The neurosciences, it's by and large, it's a disciplinary formation that's produced since the 1960s, and one of its distinctive qualities is its emphasis upon the notion of neuroplasticity. That's to say that our brains are not made and fixed forever, that they're malleable, they're mutable, they can be changed. We can be a part of the process of changing our brains, and if we can be a part of the process of changing our brains, we can be a part of the process of changing ourselves through our brains. Notions of neuroplasticity are not new. They were there in the late 19th century, but what is relatively new about them in the post-1960s period is that this mutability of the brain stretches through the life course, rather than being something that exists while we're young, and that by the time you're 30 you've had it. You're fixed, bound into a way of life forever, which was the view of William James. This conception of neuroplasticity has been drawn upon in a number of recent re-theorizations of habit in really quite different ways. And the two that I discuss in the paper are, on the one hand, the Social Brain Project, which is, if I can put it this way, a brainchild of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Art, Science and Manufacture in the UK, which is a project that draws upon Anthony Giddens' conceptions of reflexivity, links this to the neurosciences, seeing the capacity for reflexivity as something that doesn't derive just from a general theory of modernity, if you like, a la Giddens' conception, but is something that is rooted in the brain and its capacities, in the fluidity of its neural networks. And sees the business of getting people to understand the malleability of their brains and thereby inducted into a sense of the ways in which they can transform themselves through working upon their brains through programs of what Nicholas Road would call managed mindfulness, is something that they see as being really crucially important for modern democracies, provided, and this is the sting in the tail of their argument, provided, they say, everyone can develop this capacity, because like many have argued about habit, they say not everyone has this capacity yet. That's one take upon it. Another take upon neuroplasticity is that of the French philosopher Catherine Malabou, who reads the work, reads recent debates in the neurosciences, the concepts of plasticity, and she places great stress upon the ways in which the operation of synapses within neural processes produce gaps, endless number of gaps, breaks, discontinuities, in which there's a capacity for people, in her view, not to be changed through programs of managed mindfulness, but to emerge as subjects of radical self-neural creation, in ways that she links to radical political potential. In doing this, she's drawing upon conceptions of plasticity associated with Hegelian aesthetic conceptions of the sculptural arts. So you get a very different take upon the sciences, in this case the neurosciences, a very different take on those in relationship to questions of habit, from one on the one hand a sociologist in the Giddens tradition, and on the other hand a radical philosopher working in the Hegelian tradition. But just by way of concluding my answer to your question, this link between the humanities and the sciences in the domain of habit has been going on for at least 200 years. It initially becomes prominent in the early 19th century when the science of reflexology is beginning to develop, the notion of the reflex as a form of automaticity, and the ways in which various theological and earlier philosophical thinkers have to kind of like engage with this critically because of the automated mechanical conception of humanity that it implied, and their need to sort of oppose that, or to counter it not by opposing it, but by interpreting its findings in a ways that they could make them resonate with or consistent with Christian and early modern conceptions of freedom.
Well, that leads me, all this talk of changing your brain and neuroplasticity leads me to my final question, which is, doing all this work, has it given you cause to reflect upon your own habits, good and bad?
It's probably time I change my brain, there's no doubt about that. I have, no, not really, would be my honest answer to that. And I partly resist the question a little bit because there is a difference between, in the literature I think, the question of habit in the singular and good and bad habits. From the point of view of the philosophical literature and I think the theoretical literature, what's interesting about habit is not whether it's the phenomena of repetition and how repetition persists, how, where and when and why and with what consequences particular forms of repetition are modified or broken with and so on and so forth. That's a more interesting question, I think, than whether this particular habit is good or this particular habit is bad. It's more about repetition, breaches of repetition, and dynamics of personhood.
Okay, well, my brain is starting to hurt now, so I think we better put an end to it. And thanks very much, Tony, for an interesting chat.
Thanks for your question.